No one noticed the maid who collapsed in the snow that night. No one, except the most dangerous Alpha King in the north. The Great Hall of Ashvale Keep had never looked more alive. Torches burned in long rows along the stone walls, throwing gold and copper light across the faces of nobles dressed in furs and silver. Warriors stood at the edges of the room with their chests out and their eyes sharp, the kind of men who had earned their scars and wore them like medals. The long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat, honeyed bread, and wine so dark it looked almost black in the firelight. A band of musicians played in the corner, drums and strings weaving together into something warm and celebratory, something that said, "Tonight, we are untouchable." It was the winter feast, the grandest night of the season, and every single soul inside that hall knew it. Every soul except one. Saren moved through the crowd, the way water moves around stone, quiet, careful, invisible by design. She carried a heavy tray of goblets balanced against her forearm, weaving between the backs of guests who never once turned to look at her. Her uniform was plain gray wool, worn thin at the elbows. Her dark hair was pulled back tight against her neck. She kept her eyes down. That was the first rule they taught the serving girls at Ashvale: keep your eyes down, keep your feet moving, and never, under any circumstances, draw attention to yourself. Saren had followed that rule every day for 3 years. She refilled goblets. She cleared plates. She disappeared behind doors and reappeared again without anyone marking the passage. The nobles laughed around her. The warriors drank and argued about old battles. Children from the high families chased each other between the tables, and not one of them ever looked up long enough to see the girl with the tired eyes carrying the weight of the entire feast on 2 small arms. That was fine. That was normal. That was the life she had been given, and she had long since stopped wishing for a different one. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, the way certain things always are before they change everything. Saren was crossing the far end of the hall, angling toward the kitchen passage, when she felt it. A pressure. Like the air in that specific corner of the room had grown heavier than the rest of it. Warmer. Charged with something she didn't have a word for. She didn't want to look up. Every instinct she had trained into herself over 3 years said, keep your eyes down, keep moving. But her eyes moved anyway. And that was when she saw him. Alpha King Kale sat at the head of the high table the way a mountain sits at the edge of a valley, like he had always been there. And the world had simply arranged itself around him. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, dressed in deep charcoal and black fur, and he radiated the kind of authority that didn't need a crown to announce itself. The men around him were powerful. Next to him, they looked like boys. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't drinking. While everyone else in that hall was caught up in the warmth and the noise, Kale sat slightly apart from it, present, but watching, always watching. His jaw was set. His silver-gray eyes moved slowly across the room with the calm precision of a predator who has never once needed to rush. And for one single terrible second, those eyes landed on Saren. She felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. She looked away so fast, the tray in her arms nearly tipped. Her heart was slamming. She steadied the goblets with shaking fingers and forced her feet to keep moving. Keep moving. Keep moving. Through the passage door and into the cold corridor beyond, where the noise of the feast became muffled and the air bit at her flushed cheeks. She pressed her back against the stone wall and breathed. It meant nothing. Lords looked at servants all the time, through them, past them, at whatever was behind them. She was furniture to men like that. She always had been. She told herself that firmly, and then she went back to work.
What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that Kale's eyes had not moved on the moment she looked away. They had stayed exactly where she had been standing. He had noticed her scent earlier in the evening. Just a thread of it, faint and passing, carried on the movement of warm air through the hall. It had reached him mid-conversation and stopped whatever thought he'd been forming dead in its tracks. He'd gone still the way a wolf goes still when something registers that the rest of the world hasn't caught up to yet. Clean, cool, like winter air the morning after fresh snow, when everything is quiet and the light is blue and the whole world smells like it has just been made again. Moonlight. The word had arrived in his mind fully formed, and he hadn't been able to shake it. He had spent the rest of the evening doing what he always did, listening, observing, commanding the room without needing to raise his voice. He had hosted kings. He had negotiated treaties across that very table. There was not a man or woman alive who made Cale lose his composure. But that scent kept finding him, small and stubborn and entirely out of place in a room full of perfume and roasted meat and expensive wine. And then he had found the source of it, a girl in a gray dress, eyes down, moving like she was trying not to exist, and something ancient and wordless in the deepest part of him had gone very, very quiet. Why does that girl smell like moonlight? He didn't say it aloud. He almost never said the things that mattered aloud. But the question sat in his chest for the rest of the evening, low and insistent, like an ember that refused to go out. By the time the feast wound down and the great hall began to empty, Saren had made 17 trips between the dining room and the kitchen. Her feet ached. Her shoulders burned. The last of the serving girls had been dismissed an hour ago, but the head housekeeper had pulled Saren aside with a sharp look and a list of final tasks. The outside torches needed collecting, the side courtyard gate needed latching, and if Saren knew what was good for her, she'd have it done before the snow started up again. Saren had nodded and gone without complaint. That was the second rule they taught the serving girls at Ashvale. She didn't realize, until she was already outside, and the heavy side door had swung shut behind her, that it had locked. The cold hit her like a wall. She was wearing nothing but her thin gray wool uniform. The courtyard torches had already burned low, and the sky above Ashvale was a deep, moonless black, and the snow that was not supposed to start yet, was already falling in thick, silent sheets that swallowed sound and light and warmth whole. Saren turned back to the door and pulled the handle. It didn't move. She pulled again, harder. Then she knocked once, twice, 3 times the sound small and swallowed immediately by the wind. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard nothing. No footsteps. No voices. The feast was over. The staff had gone to bed, and the door was locked from the inside, and no one in the world knew she was out here. The cold moved through her thin dress in seconds, pressing against her skin like something with teeth. She wrapped her arms around herself and looked across the empty white courtyard, and for the first time in a very long time, the fear that rose in her chest was not the quiet, manageable kind she had learned to live with. It was the kind that understood what was actually at stake. The snow kept falling. No one noticed the maid locked outside in the cold that night. No one, except the wolf who had been wondering about her scent for the last 3 hours, the one whose window faced that exact courtyard, the one who had not yet gone to bed, the most dangerous alpha king in the north, and he was already moving. I told myself not to panic. Panic was a luxury I had never been able to afford, not in 3 years of service at Ashvale Keep, not in the years before that when life had been even harder and even quieter, and there had been no one watching out for me then either. So I pressed my back against the locked door, and I breathed slowly, deliberately, and I told myself there was a solution to this. There was always a solution. I just needed to think. The snow did not care about my thinking. It came down in walls now, thick and sideways, driven by a wind that had no patience and no mercy. Within the first minute outside, it had found every gap in my thin wool uniform, the loose collar, the worn hem, the place where the fabric had thinned to near nothing at my left shoulder, and it pressed through all of them with something that felt almost purposeful, almost cruel. I moved along the wall, keeping one hand on the stone to hold my bearings. The courtyard was not large, but in the dark and the snow, it felt enormous and directionless, the kind of space that rearranges itself when you're not looking. I knew there was a second entrance on the far side, a wooden gate that led around to the servants' wing, and if I could reach it, if it wasn't also locked, if someone had thought to leave it unlatched, then I could get inside and get warm and pretend this night had never happened. That was what I focused on, the gate, 1 foot in front of the other. But somewhere between the 3rd step and the 4th, a thought slipped in through the cold and took hold before I could stop it. The door had locked behind me, not blown shut locked. I had heard the mechanism catch, that specific, deliberate sound of a bolt sliding home. And I thought about the head housekeeper's sharp eyes when she'd pulled me aside. The timing of it, the way the other girls had already been dismissed before she gave me the final task list. The way she'd said, "If you know what's good for you," with just a little too much weight behind it for a simple instruction about courtyard torches. Someone had sent me out here knowing the door would lock. Someone had wanted me out here. The cold took on a different quality after that realization. It wasn't just weather anymore, it was intention. And standing in the middle of it, in my thin gray dress with no cloak and no light, and no one in the entire keep who would notice I was gone until morning, possibly not even then, I understood exactly how vulnerable I actually was, how carefully invisible I had made myself over 3 years, and how easily that same invisibility could be turned into a weapon against me. I kept moving. I had to keep moving. The cold was settling into my bones now, moving past discomfort into something deeper and more serious. My fingers had gone from painful to numb. My feet felt thick and distant. I knew enough about winters in the north to know that this was the stage that came before the dangerous stage, and that the dangerous stage came faster than most people expected it to. I pressed forward through the snow, and I tried very hard not to think about the moment at the feast. I failed. It came back to me the way things do when your defenses are down and your body is frightened and there's nothing left to hide behind. That one unguarded second when I had looked up from my tray and found the Alpha King's eyes already on me, silver gray and utterly still. Not the absent gaze of a lord looking through a servant. Something else. Something focused and specific, and for just that half a second before I tore my eyes away, something almost searching. Why did he look at me like that? The question was foolish, and I knew it was foolish. Men like Cale did not look at girls like me with any intention worth examining. I was nobody. I was a gray dress, and a low gaze, and a pair of hands that refilled goblets without spilling. That was all I was in that hall. And whatever I thought I had seen in his expression for that one fleeting moment was almost certainly a story I had told myself because I was cold and scared, and my mind was reaching for something warm to hold on to. I almost convinced myself of that. Almost. My foot caught on something buried under the snow. A stone lip, a step edge, something solid and unforgiving, and I went down hard, one knee hitting the frozen ground first, then my palms, the tray I was still somehow carrying clattering away into the dark. The cold of the ground came up through my hands instantly, vicious and electric. I pushed myself back upright. My knee was throbbing. My palms were scraped. I looked ahead. The gate was closer now. I could make out its outline through the snow, or I thought I could. I wasn't entirely certain anymore whether I was seeing clearly, or whether the cold was beginning to soften the edges of things. I took another step, and then my legs simply stopped cooperating. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fall like the first one, where there was something to trip over and a clear cause and effect. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. My legs just gave. Like the cold had finally located the last warm thing keeping them working and snuffed it out. I went down slowly, one hand dragging against the wall, and then I was sitting in the snow with my back against the stone, and the wind pressing my hair flat across my face, and I couldn't immediately find the energy or the coordination to get back up. I pressed my hands against my thighs and focused on breathing. "Get up," I told myself. "Get up right now. This is not the place." I was still telling myself that when the darkness at the edges of my vision began to thicken, inside the great hall, the last of the candles had burned to stubs. The servants had banked the fires and retreated to their quarters. The nobles had drifted off to their guest rooms in various stages of wine warmth and satisfied exhaustion. The feast was over, and Ashvale Keep was settling into the particular deep silence that only comes to large stone buildings in the dead of winter, heavy and complete and undisturbed. Cale stood at the window of the upper corridor. He wasn't sure what had brought him there. He had been on his way to his chambers, his mind already moving through tomorrow's agenda. The border reports, the morning sparring session, the council meeting he was already anticipating with something close to contempt. His mind was always moving. That was the nature of what he was and what he carried. An Alpha King did not get the luxury of a quiet head. But somewhere between the staircase and his door, something had pulled him sideways. A sensation. Not pain, nothing as specific as that. More like a sound heard from a great distance. something below the threshold of normal hearing, the kind of thing his wolf caught before his human mind had any framework for it. He stopped walking. His wolf, that second self, that deep and ancient animal consciousness that lived in the marrow of him, had gone rigid, alert in a way that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with something else, something more complicated. It wasn't the growl he felt when danger was incoming. This was different, lower, almost distressed. Find her. The thought arrived not as language exactly, but as a pull, physical, directional, his body already angling toward the corridor window before his mind had finished processing what was happening. He looked down into the courtyard. For a moment the snow was too heavy and the night too dark, and he saw nothing. And then his vision adjusted the way it always did when his wolf pushed through and the shapes below resolved into something his mind refused to accept for a full second. A girl, sitting in the snow against the far wall, not moving, gray dress, dark hair plastered flat by the wet snow, arms wrapped around herself and going still. The scent reached him a half-second later, cutting through the cold and the stone and the glass between them like none of those things existed at all. Moonlight. Cale was already moving before the thought was complete. He didn't take a cloak. He didn't call for anyone. He didn't stop at the base of the stairs to put on the heavy winter boots sitting beside the side entrance, though he registered their absence the moment the cold hit him. None of that mattered. None of that was the point. The point was the girl in the snow on the other side of the courtyard, and his legs were eating up the distance between them with a speed and a single-mindedness that his rational mind was only half keeping pace with. The snow was deep and still falling, and he crossed it in seconds. She was sitting with her back against the stone wall, her knees drawn up, her head dropped forward just slightly. Her dark hair was wet and heavy against her face, her hands bare, no gloves. Nothing were pressed flat against her thighs in a posture that looked like the last deliberate thing she'd managed before her body stopped taking orders. Cale crouched down in front of her. "Hey." His voice came out lower than he intended. Quieter. He hadn't planned the tone, it arrived on its own. "Look at me." She didn't respond. He reached out and pressed 2 fingers under her jaw, tilting her face up carefully, and what he saw sent something cold moving through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her lips had taken on a faint blue tint at the edges. Her lashes were dusted white with snow. Her skin, where he touched it, was so cold it almost didn't feel like skin anymore. She was still breathing, shallow, slow, but there. Something in his chest that had been wound tight since the moment he'd seen her from the window came fractionally loose at the confirmation. He slid one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees, and he lifted her in a single, clean motion, and she was lighter than she should have been, lighter than he expected, and that detail landed somewhere uncomfortable in the back of his mind and stayed there. For a moment she didn't respond at all to being moved, and then, and he felt this more than saw it, her hand shifted. Slow and barely conscious, her fingers found the lapel of his jacket and closed around the fabric. Not a grip exactly, more like a reflex, like something in her, even now, was still trying to hold on to whatever warmth it could find. Cale looked down at her hand against his chest. He didn't move it. He stood up with her in his arms and turned back toward the keep, and it was only then that he registered what he had not registered on the way out the cluster of figures standing in the open doorway. 3 of his senior warriors, 2 of the remaining household staff, all of them frozen in the kind of stunned stillness that told him they had watched the whole thing and were now doing the rapid mental arithmetic of what it meant. He had carried a servant girl across the courtyard in the middle of a blizzard, their alpha king, with his own hands. None of them said a word. Cale looked at them one steady, level sweep, and then he looked at the courtyard behind him, at the locked side door, at the unlit torches, at the evidence of what should have been a simple errand turned into something that had almost cost this girl her life tonight. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. That was the thing about Cale's authority, that even the most senior men at Ashvale had never fully gotten comfortable with. It was never loud. It didn't need to be. When his wolf was close to the surface, his voice dropped rather than rose, took on a low, resonant quality that seemed to travel through the floor rather than the air, and landed somewhere inside the chest of whoever he was addressing. Who left her out here? 3 words, barely above conversational volume. The courtyard went silent. The wind seemed to pause. Every figure in that doorway, warriors who had stood on battlefields and held their ground against things that would have broken ordinary men, went completely, utterly still. Not one of them had an answer. And that silence, Cale understood immediately, was its own kind of answer. He looked down once more at the girl in his arms, at her hand still curled into his lapel, at the snow still settled in her dark hair, at the shallow, fragile rise and fall of her chest. Then he looked back up at the doorway. Find out. He walked inside. And behind him, every single person who had witnessed what just happened understood with the deep animal certainty that lives below logic and reason that something had just shifted in Ashvale Keep. Something quiet and irreversible and enormous. The entire hall held its breath. Warmth was the first thing. Not light, not sound warmth. It came back slowly, the way feeling always returns to something that has been numb too long, in small, uncomfortable increments that were almost painful before they became a relief. Saren became aware of it gradually, layer by layer, the weight of thick blankets, the deep, steady heat radiating from somewhere nearby, the absence of wind, the absence of cold stone against her back. She lay still for a long moment before she opened her eyes, because some part of her already understood that when she did, something would be different. Something would require her to respond to it, and she wasn't ready yet. So she stayed in the almost dark behind her eyelids and let the warmth work its way back through her, and she listened. A fire. Close. The low, rhythmic pop and settle of burning wood. And breathing. Quiet, steady, and not her own. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was not the low, water-stained plaster of the servants' dormitory. It was stone and dark timber, vaulted and vast, with iron chandeliers hanging unlit in the shadows above and carved details at the beams that she had never seen up close, but recognized immediately from the one time she had glimpsed this corridor through a half-open door 3 years ago and been sharply told to look somewhere else. These were the Alpha's chambers. She was in the Alpha King's bed. Saren sat up so fast the room tilted sideways, and she had to press one hand flat against the mattress to stop the ceiling from completing its rotation. The blankets fell away from her shoulders. She was still in her uniform, her damp, ruined uniform, but someone had removed her wet outer layer and her boots and covered her with enough bedding to heat a small village. Her hands, she noticed when she looked down at them, had been wrapped in soft cloth. Her knee, the one she'd hit going down in the snow, had been bandaged. She stared at the bandaging on her knee for a full 3 seconds. "You move fast for someone who nearly died an hour ago." The voice came from the chair beside the fireplace. Saren turned. Cale sat with his forearms resting on his knees, jacket removed, shirt collar open at the throat, watching her with those silver-gray eyes that were exactly as direct and unsettling up close as they had been across a crowded hall. He looked entirely at ease. He also looked like he had absolutely no intention of being anywhere else. Saren opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Your Majesty." Her voice came out rough and thin, scraped clean by the cold. She cleared her throat. This is your room." "It is. I should go." She moved to push the blankets aside entirely, and his head tilted slightly, just one fraction, in a way that somehow communicated you can try without a single word being spoken. "You were hypothermic," he said. "Your core temperature was low enough that the healer wanted to monitor you through the night. She also wanted to move you to the infirmary." A brief pause. "I disagreed." Saren looked at him. "You disagreed. The infirmary is on the north side of the keep, coldest wing in winter." His voice was level, factual, as though this were a perfectly ordinary logistical assessment and not an Alpha King explaining why he had put a serving girl in his personal bed. "This room has the largest fire in the building." She stared at him. She knew, in the rational and functional part of her brain, that she should be grateful. She was grateful. She was also sitting in the most powerful man in the Northern Territory's private chambers in her ruined work uniform, at what she suspected was somewhere past midnight, and every instinct she had spent 3 years carefully developing was firing at once. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, I genuinely appreciate what you did tonight. Bringing me in, the healer, She gestured at her bandaged knee with a kind of helpless precision. "All of it, but I'm just a maid." Something shifted in his expression. "Not much, just enough. I'm aware of what your position is. Then you understand that me being in here is..." She searched for the right word and landed on the honest one. "Complicated, for both of us. People will talk, and I don't have the kind of standing that survives people talking. And I really think it would be better for everyone if I went back to the..." You nearly froze to death. He said it the way he said everything, quietly, without apparent effort, with the absolute weight of someone who has never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. "That makes you my problem now." The silence that followed that sentence was enormous. Saren looked at him. He looked back at her. The fire between them crackled and threw warm light across the side of his face. And for a moment, the only thing she was aware of was how utterly still he was, not the stillness of someone performing patience, but the genuine, animal stillness of a predator who has already decided and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. She said, almost without meaning to, "You can't just decide that. I just did." She pressed her lips together. Somewhere, distantly, she was aware that she was arguing with the Alpha King of the Northern Territories in his own bedroom in the middle of the night, and that this was objectively the most dangerous conversation she had ever had, and that she should stop immediately. She did not stop immediately. "With respect," she said, "I've been managing my own problems for quite some time without... Someone locked you outside in a blizzard tonight." His voice didn't change volume. It didn't need to. The words themselves were enough to cut through everything she'd been building up to say and leave a clean, cold silence behind them. Intentionally, during the worst storm of the season, in a uniform with no cloak and no way back in, he held her gaze. "How well were you managing that particular problem?" Saren closed her mouth. She hated, with a quiet and profound intensity, that he was right. She looked down at her wrapped hands. The cloth was softer than anything in the servants' quarters, softer than anything she had touched in a very long time, and for some reason that small detail was the thing that made her chest tighten in a way she wasn't prepared for. She pressed the feeling down quickly and looked back up. "I'll be fine by morning," she said. "I can go back to my duties and we can..." "Sleep," he said it simply. "You can argue with me about the rest of it tomorrow." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't blink. Saren lay back against the pillows slowly, with the careful dignity of someone making a tactical withdrawal rather than admitting defeat, and pulled the blankets back up around her shoulders and stared at the vaulted ceiling above her. Across the room, Cale leaned back in his chair and said nothing further, but he did not leave. By morning, Ashvale Keep was already talking. It moved the way gossip always moves through a large household, in low voices and significant looks, through doorways and down corridors, gaining detail and weight with each retelling. By the time the kitchen fires were lit and the breakfast preparations were underway, every senior noble guest still in residence had heard some version of it. By the time the morning meal was served, the story had developed texture. The Alpha King had carried a maid across the courtyard in a blizzard, had taken her to his chambers, had dismissed the healer's suggestion to move her, had sat beside her through the night. Some of them said it with concern. Most of them said it with something else entirely. Saren became aware of the whispers the moment she returned to her duties quietly, without fanfare, early enough that she had hoped to slip back into the rhythm of the keep before anyone had reason to look at her. She had been wrong about that. She was wrong about most things involving invisibility that morning. The looks followed her from the kitchen to the corridor. From the corridor to the dining hall, longer than usual, heavier. Women in fine morning dresses tracked her movements with eyes that were doing rapid and unfriendly calculations. Warriors who had never once looked at her directly found reasons to be standing in hallways she was walking through. She kept her eyes down and kept moving. That was all she could do. He was watching her again. She knew it the way you know a fire is behind you, even when you're facing the other direction, as warmth, as a kind of atmospheric pressure, as a change in the quality of the air. She had felt it twice before noon and once more during the midday clearing, and each time she had done exactly what she always did, kept her hands moving, kept her expression neutral, and refused to look up. It was significantly harder than it used to be. Cale moved through the keep's common spaces that morning with the same contained authority he always carried, conducting the ordinary business of managing a kingdom brief conversations with advisors, a short review session with his senior warriors in the training corridor, a quiet walk through the great hall that had everyone in it subtly straightening without being asked. He was not watching her constantly. He was not making it obvious. He was simply present. In every room she happened to be working in. Coincidence was not a concept Saren placed a great deal of faith in. She overheard 2 of his warriors near the eastern corridor just before midday. She wasn't trying to listen, she was reaching across the side table to collect abandoned goblets, close enough to the doorway that their voices carried clearly. 3rd time he's passed through the hall in 2 hours. The first voice was male, low, and thoroughly amused. "Keep your mouth shut." The second was slightly less amused and considerably more cautious. "I'm just noting a pattern. You're going to become a pattern. Specifically, a pattern of bruises. Keep your mouth shut." A pause. Then, irrepressibly, he watched her carry a tray for 4 full minutes. "I timed it." Saren moved away from the doorway before she could hear the response, but the heat in her face followed her for the next 10 minutes. The noble women were considerably less subtle than the warriors. There were 4 of them who had stayed on after the feast. High-ranking guests, daughters of allied lords, exactly the kind of women who had been carefully positioned near Cale over the years in the persistent and apparently indestructible hope that one of them would eventually catch his attention. They were all accomplished, all beautiful in expensive, deliberate ways. And all of them, Saren had noticed years before she had any reason to care, had been met by Cale with the same courteous and impenetrable disinterest. They were not looking at Cale with that expression this morning. They were looking at Saren. She felt their attention like a different kind of cold, not the brutal, honest cold of the blizzard, but the precise and pointed cold of women who have identified a problem and are deciding how to address it. She kept her gaze down and her movements efficient, and she told herself, firmly, that she did not care. She was a maid. She would always be a maid. Whatever had happened last night, the locked door, the snow, the arms that had lifted her out of the dark and carried her somewhere warm, that was over. She was back in her uniform, and back in her place, and the world of Ashvale Keep had its order back. She was carrying a tray of water pitchers down the south corridor when her hand slipped. It was nothing dramatic. A simple miscalculation. The tray shifted slightly. She overcorrected, and the edge of the nearest pitcher caught the side of her palm where the skin was still tender from the night before. She hissed softly through her teeth and looked down. A clean cut, not deep, running along the heel of her hand. It was already welling red. She set the tray down on the corridor sideboard and pressed her other thumb against the cut, reaching for the small cloth she kept tucked at her waist. She didn't hear footsteps. There were no footsteps. One moment she was alone in the corridor, and the next a hand had closed around her wrist, warm and steady, and absolutely certain of itself, and she looked up into Cale's face from a distance of less than 2 feet. She stopped breathing for a moment. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hand, his fingers wrapped around her wrist with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the sheer physical fact of him. He turned her palm toward the light from the corridor window, examining the cut with an expression that was quiet and focused, and something else underneath something coiled, and very close to the surface. "It's nothing," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Truly, I've had worse." He didn't respond immediately. His thumb moved just slightly, just a fraction along the inside of her wrist, not over the cut but below it, where her pulse was. She wasn't sure he was even aware he'd done it. Then something changed. It was subtle enough that she almost missed it. A fractional shift in his posture, a barely perceptible tension moving through the hand holding her wrist. His eyes, which had been focused on the cut, went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Sharper, more internal somehow, as though his attention had turned suddenly inward. And beside her, in the corridor, she felt something. It wasn't a sound, and it wasn't a touch, and she had absolutely no framework for what it actually was, only that it moved through the air between them like a vibration, low and resonant, and it made every fine hair on her arms stand up in a single wave. His wolf. She felt his wolf react. And then, impossibly answering it like a call being returned across a great distance, she felt something stir inside herself, something she had never felt before, something she had no name for and no context for and no way of understanding, except that it was old, and it was deep, and it recognized him. Cale's gaze came up from her hand and met her eyes. His expression had changed entirely. Gone was the careful composure, the controlled authority, the impenetrable quiet he wore like a second skin. What was underneath it, just for that one unguarded moment before the mask came back, was something rawer than she was prepared for, something that looked a great deal like shock. He looked at her hand, back to her eyes, down to the blood welling slowly from the cut at her palm, catching the light from the window in a way that made it look almost luminous. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a murmur. "Who are you?" She had no answer to give him. And in the deep, silent, animal part of him that had been asking questions about her since last night, the part that had pulled him to a window in a snowstorm and driven him across a frozen courtyard without his boots, something ancient and certain and enormous was beginning to understand that the blood on her palm was not ordinary, that she was not ordinary, that whatever she was carrying beneath her skin, it had been waiting a very long time for him to find it. She pulled her wrist back gently, not sharply, not with alarm, gently, the way you remove something fragile from a situation before it can become something else. Cale let her go the moment she moved, his hand falling to his side, but his eyes didn't leave her face, and the question he had just asked was still hanging in the corridor between them like smoke after a flame goes out. "Who are you?" Saren wrapped the cloth from her waist around her palm herself, tucking the end with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who had been handling her own small injuries alone for a very long time. And when she was done, she picked up the tray from the sideboard and looked at him with the most level expression she could assemble. "A maid," she said. "Same as I was this morning." He said nothing. He simply watched her with those silver-gray eyes that she was beginning to understand were not just quiet, they were reading. Constantly, carefully reading, taking in information and filing it somewhere behind that composed face, with a precision that made her feel, uncomfortably, like a text being translated. She moved to step around him. Saren. It was the first time he had used her name. She hadn't told it to him herself, he had found it out, which meant he had asked, which meant at some point this morning he had thought to ask, and the sound of it in his voice, low and unhurried, stopped her more effectively than a hand on her arm would have. She didn't turn around immediately. She gave herself exactly 2 seconds to get her expression right. Then she turned. "Your Majesty, your hand needs the healer before you continue working. It's a small cut. It's an open wound that you're about to put back on a serving tray in a household corridor. Go to the healer." A beat. Then quieter. "Please." That last word clearly cost him something. Not much, but something. She could tell by the barely perceptible pause before it, like a man reaching for a door he doesn't usually need to open. She went to the healer. The keep's healer was a compact, gray-haired woman named Dara, who had been at Ashvale longer than most of the stone, and had the disposition of someone who had long since run out of patience for nonsense, but retained a deep and genuine care for the people underneath. She cleaned Saren's cut efficiently, applied a herbed salve that smelled of pine resin and something sweeter, and then held Saren's hand still for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Cold came in deep last night," she said, not quite looking at Saren directly. "Sometimes takes the body longer than people think to come all the way back." "I'm fine," Saren said. Dara released her hand. "You're stubborn," she said, which is a different thing, though it tends to feel the same. She handed her a small folded cloth of spare salve for the evening. "Take care of the hand." Saren thanked her and left. She walked back through the keep's mid-morning quiet and did not let herself think too hard about what had happened in the corridor. about the warmth of his hand on her wrist, about the thing she had felt stir inside herself, that impossible deep resonance, like a voice she'd never heard somehow answering a call she hadn't known she was making. She pressed it down. She was good at pressing things down. She had been doing it for 10 years, since the night everything had burned, and she had run and kept running until she found somewhere small enough and quiet enough to disappear into. She did not think about that either. She was very good at not thinking about that. What she let herself think about instead, as she moved through the stone corridors with her bandaged hand and her tray, and the eyes she kept carefully lowered, was the practical geometry of her situation. Someone in this keep had locked her outside last night with deliberate intention. That person had not been caught yet, or if they had, she hadn't been informed of it, which amounted to the same thing, which meant that person was still here, still watching, still, presumably, possessed of whatever motivation had driven them to do it the first time. She needed to be careful, more careful than she had been. She turned down the corridor toward the servants' wing as the afternoon light began its slow, horizontal slide through the high windows, turning the stone walls briefly amber, and she was so focused on the geometry of her thinking that she almost didn't notice the footsteps behind her until they were close. She noticed them, though. She always noticed. She didn't slow down. She didn't speed up. She listened to the gate even, unhurried, long-strided, and knew before she turned that it was him. "You don't need to follow me," she said without turning. "I'm not following you," Cale said, falling into step beside her with the casual precision of someone who has never in his life needed to adjust his pace for a corridor. "I'm walking in the same direction." She glanced up at him sideways. "The servants' quarters are in the same direction as wherever you're going." Apparently. She looked forward again. "Your Majesty, you shouldn't walk alone." He said it the same way he said most things, without particular emphasis, as though he were simply noting a fact that existed independent of his preferences. "Not after last night. Not until we know who's responsible." Saren was quiet for a moment. The corridor stretched ahead of them, torchlit and narrow, and the strange intimacy of walking side by side with an Alpha King in a passage built for foot traffic and supply carts was not lost on her. She was acutely aware of how much space he occupied, not aggressively, just completely, solidly, the way very large, very certain things occupy space. "I've survived worse than dark hallways," she said. She felt him look at her. Then, from somewhere slightly unexpected, "I know." She glanced up at that, quickly, and what she found on his face when she did stopped the response she'd been preparing. Not the careful composure she'd come to expect from him. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, briefly and without apparent intention, like genuine recognition, like he meant exactly that and nothing diplomatic about it. And then so small, so fleeting that she almost decided she'd imagined it one corner of his mouth moved. Not a grin, not even close to a grin, just a slight, private shift, almost reluctant, like a reaction he'd failed to suppress rather than one he'd chosen to show. Saren stared at him for half a second. Cale, she would learn, almost never smiled. His warriors had discussed this among themselves as though it were a meteorological event of some rarity. The senior advisor had allegedly once remarked that he'd seen the man receive news of a battlefield victory with the same expression most people wore when reviewing tax documents. She had made him almost smile in a servant's corridor on a Tuesday morning. She didn't know what to do with that at all. She looked forward again. Neither of them spoke for the remainder of the walk, and when they reached the turn that led to the servants' quarters, Cale stopped and she continued. And she made it exactly 4 steps past the corner before she allowed the breath she'd been holding to come out slowly through her nose. She stood still for a moment in the empty passage. Her bandaged hand was warm where Dara's salve had been applied. Her chest was doing something complicated and unwelcome. Down the corridor behind her, she could hear the absolute absence of retreating footsteps. He hadn't moved yet either. She walked on. She didn't look back. She didn't see, because she was looking forward, the figure standing in the deep shadow of the alcove 20 feet behind where they'd parted, still, watching, with eyes that had tracked the entire walk from the main corridor to the servant's turn and filed every detail of it away with the cold, methodical attention of someone constructing a plan. The figure watched the place where Saren had turned the corner. Then it watched the place where the Alpha King still stood. Then it moved quietly in the opposite direction and disappeared. He found her in the eastern garden just before dusk. She was there by accident, or what passed for accident in Saren's life, which was mostly just the accumulated consequence of choosing the quietest available option. She had finished her evening duties early and slipped outside before anyone could find more for her, drawn by the last of the pale winter light on the snow-covered hedges and the simple, uncomplicated relief of being somewhere that wasn't watched. She heard him before she saw him. That even, unhurried gait. She had already learned it in less than 2 days, which unsettled her more than she chose to examine. He appeared at the garden stone archway and stopped there, his hands in the pockets of his heavy outer coat, looking at her with that reading expression. She was slowly beginning to distinguish from his other expressions there were more of them than she had initially thought. Most people, looking at Cale, saw a single face. The longer she was near him, the more she realized it was actually many faces, layered close, each one slightly more specific than the last. "You're not supposed to be out here alone," he said. "You're not supposed to be in the East Garden," she replied. "It's maintenance, only space in winter. No nobles, no guards, no," she gestured, "kings. I'll add it to the list of rules I'm breaking this week." She looked at him. He looked back. The last of the daylight was going amber and low, catching the edges of the snow and turning them briefly gold, and in that light Ashvale Keep looked, for just a moment, like a place that might contain warmth. Then Cale walked into the garden and sat down on the stone bench along the inner wall, and the quality of the air shifted, and Saren understood without being told that this was not the same as walking a corridor. This was deliberate. This was him choosing to be somewhere specifically, which meant there was something he had come to say. She sat on the far end of the bench and waited. He was quiet for a while. That was not unusual. She had learned that he held silence differently than most people. Not as a gap to be filled, but as a space he was comfortable occupying. She matched it and did not press, and eventually he spoke. "There's something you should know." He was looking at the garden, not at her. Before what goes further? He didn't answer that directly. "When I was 22, he said, "I loved someone. Her name was Mira. She was the daughter of the Eastern Pack's second, and she was remarkable, sharp and stubborn and entirely unimpressed by me, which at the time I found irritating and eventually understood was the point." A pause. "She died 8 months after I declared her my intended. A sickness that moved fast and gave no warning and left nothing behind it that the healers could identify or explain." Saren said nothing. She could hear, underneath the even delivery, the particular flatness of a grief that has been carried so long it has worn smooth. "The year after that," Cale continued, "there was a woman named Asha. She was kind and she didn't deserve what happened to her. And what happened to her was the same thing, in the same time frame, with the same absence of explanation." He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her. "The shamans found the curse in the 3rd year. It had been placed on my bloodline before I was born, old magic, the kind that doesn't negotiate and doesn't lift. The terms are simple." He was quiet for a moment. "Any woman I love will die for it. The closer I am to her, the faster it moves." The garden was very still. Saren sat with what he had just said and let it settle. She didn't fill the silence with immediate sound, which she knew, from the brief fractional shift in his posture, was not what he had been expecting. When she did speak, her voice was quiet and very direct. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been told I have a responsibility to disclose it. To anyone who might," he stopped, selected a different word. "To anyone in proximity." "That's very procedural of you." Something moved across his expression. "Saren, I heard you," she said. "I'm not dismissing it. I'm noting that you told me the way you'd file a border report, and I think you deserve a real response rather than the one you're braced for." He looked at her fully now. "Which response am I braced for?" "Pity. The soft kind or the horrified kind. You've probably had both." She met his gaze steadily. "I don't pity you. 2 women died, and that is a real and terrible thing, and I'm genuinely sorry for it. But I'm not going to look at you the way people look at something broken, because that isn't what you are. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Fuller, like something had shifted beneath the surface of it. Then don't love me, she said. Simple, level. The only logical conclusion to the information as presented. If the curse requires it, then the answer is simple. Keep the distance. Cale looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood from the bench, and he turned toward her, and he took one step that closed half the space between them, and then another that closed most of the rest of it, until he was standing close enough that she had to angle her chin up slightly to hold his gaze. And the warmth that came off him in the cold garden air was the same warmth she had registered that first night, waking in the dark, enormous and steady, and not quite like anything she had a comparison for. His voice, when it came, was barely above a murmur. That might be too late. Saren's breath held. Not from fear, not exactly. From the specific and disorienting vertigo of hearing something that your rational mind insists cannot be true, and your entire body responds to as though it is the truest thing it has ever been told. The thing deep inside her, that old, wordless resonance that had stirred in the corridor when his skin touched her wrist, rose up quietly in the silence after his words like an answer. She pressed it down. She pressed it down hard. She was good at that. It needs to not be too late, she said. Her voice held. She was proud of it for holding. For both our sakes. He looked at her. She looked at him. The last of the amber light was fading from the garden's snow, and the cold was moving back in with the blue of early evening, and neither of them moved for a breath, and then another. Go inside, he said quietly. Not a command exactly. Something that cost more than a command. She went. She walked back through the archway and along the path to the servants' entrance without looking back, her bandaged hand pressed against the opposite arm for warmth, her mind doing the thing it always did in moments of emotional overload, retreating into logistics, practicality, the next task, the next hour, anything forward-facing and manageable. She did not see the figure in the upper window of the keep's east wing, looking down at the garden. She did not see the small glass vial in its hand, or the color of the liquid inside it dark and viscous and faintly luminous in the last of the failing light. She did not hear the single quiet word the figure spoke as she disappeared through the door below. But the word was spoken, and the plan was already in motion. The attack came in the deepest hour of the night, when even the torches in the servants' corridor had burned down to their last inch, and the keep was so quiet you could hear the snow settling on the window ledges outside. Saren was asleep when the door opened. She came awake the way she always did, fast and completely. No groggy middle ground, a survival habit built so deep into her nervous system over the years that it had long since stopped feeling like effort. She was upright in her cot before the figure in the doorway had taken a second step, and in the half-dark she had just enough time to register two things: that the figure was not another Maid, and that what it was holding in its right hand caught the last faint torchlight in the corridor with the unmistakable gleam of a blade. She rolled left off the cot the same moment it lunged. The blade caught the edge of her blanket and tore through it cleanly, good steel, sharp, meant for this specifically, and the figure recovered fast, faster than she expected, pivoting toward her with a practiced efficiency that told her this was not someone acting on impulsive anger. This was someone who had done this before. She had 2 feet of empty floor between herself and the wall and nothing in her hands, and she used the only advantage available to her, the darkness and the geography of the room she had slept in every night for 3 years, and knew, by feel. She moved sideways along the wall toward the room's single window, putting the cot between herself and the figure, and she opened her mouth to scream. The figure crossed the cot in one motion and closed a hand over her mouth before the sound fully formed. She bit down. Hard. The figure made a short, sharp sound, and the grip loosened just enough. She drove her elbow back, connected. The grip broke entirely, and she was already turning, already pulling breath for the scream properly this time. The door came off its hinges. Not opened, not broken open, Off its hinges entirely, the entire door frame splintering inward in a single explosive impact that shook the walls and knocked the small shelf above Saren's cot clean of its contents. And the sound of it was enormous in the narrow room, a crash that seemed to compress the air and then release it all at once. Cale stood in the doorway. She had seen him composed. She had seen him controlled in ways that felt almost unnatural given the authority he carried. She had seen him walk through a crowded hall and silence it without a word. She had never seen him like this. His face was stripped of everything that usually sat on top of it. The composure, the careful containment, all of it gone. What was underneath was something older and rawer and entirely animal, and the force of it filled the small room the way a fire fills a space, consuming all available air. His eyes, silver gray in daylight, had gone luminous in the dark. His wolf was fully at the surface, barely leashed, and the low sound coming from somewhere in his chest was not quite human and registered somewhere below conscious hearing, in the part of the body that remembers, without needing to be told, what it means to be in a room with an apex predator who has located a threat. The figure holding the blade made a sound that was very close to a whimper. Cale crossed the room in 3 steps and had the attacker by the throat before the blade had finished clattering to the floor, and he lifted one-handed, effortless, with the absolute terrible ease of someone for whom the weight of another person presents no more resistance than a door handle, and the figure's feet left the ground. "Cale." Saren's voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Cale, look at me." He didn't look at her. His attention was entirely fixed on the figure in his grip, with an intensity that was not anger exactly anger could be reasoned with, diffused, redirected. This was something beyond anger. This was the place anger goes when it has found its object and stopped needing a name. The figure's face was going dark. "Cale." She stepped forward and put her hand on his arm. The contact moved through him visibly. She felt the muscles beneath her palm locked rigid, vibrating with the effort of the restraint that was already there, whatever was left of it. And she kept her hand flat and steady, and she said his name again, quietly, the way you speak to something powerful that needs to hear a specific frequency to come back from the edge. His eyes moved to her. The luminous quality in them shifted. Not gone, but present behind something else now. Something that was looking at her specifically. "Don't become a monster because of me," she said. The words landed. She watched them land. Watched something move through his face, past the fury and the animal and the thing that had come through the door with the force of a wall coming down. His grip didn't loosen immediately. It took 3 full seconds, and those 3 seconds were some of the most charged she had ever stood inside. Then his hand opened. The figure dropped, hit the floor, and immediately folded in on itself, gasping. Cale stepped back. 1 step, then another, the luminosity in his eyes fading by degrees, the terrible animal force of him pulling back below the surface like a tide retreating controlled, but with the kind of visible effort that told her exactly how thin the margin had been. He turned to her. His gaze moved across her face, her throat, her arms quick and methodical, cataloging, looking for damage. "I'm not hurt," she said. "The door took more damage than I did." Something flickered in his expression. Something that, under different circumstances, in a different moment, might have been relief. Right now it was too tangled up with everything else to sit cleanly. The corridor outside was filling. She could hear feet warriors, household staff, voices low and urgent. 2 of Cale's senior men appeared in the destroyed doorway, took in the scene, and went very still with the trained efficiency of men who have learned to assess before they react. One of them looked at the figure on the floor, then at Cale, then back at the figure, and something in his expression sharpened into recognition. "My lord," he said carefully, "that's Aldrich's man." The name sat in the room. Saren didn't know it, but she watched what it did to the faces of every person standing in that doorway, the specific, tight rearrangement of features that happens when something suspected is confirmed, and the confirmation is worse than the suspicion. She watched Cale's jaw set, watched the stillness that came over him harden from the raw stillness of barely contained fury into something colder and more deliberate. Lord Aldrich, 3rd-ranked noble in the Northern Territories, Cale's own council member, The man who had sat 12 feet away from him at the feast 2 nights ago and raised a goblet in a toast. The man who had been positioning for the alpha seat for 15 years through channels, too careful to touch, and alliances too intricate to cleanly unravel, and who had apparently decided that a maid who had caught the alpha king's attention represented a complication worth removing before it could become something he couldn't manage. Cale looked at the figure on the floor for a long moment. Then he looked at his men in the doorway. "Find him," he said. They went. They found Aldrich by morning. Saren knew this because the keep told her. The way large households always tell things in the movement of people, the quality of silences, the specific way the kitchen went quiet when she came in for her morning duties, and then erupted in low, urgent conversation the moment she moved out of earshot. She worked through it. She moved through her tasks methodically, kept her head down, kept her hands busy, and tried very hard not to think about the look on Cale's face when he had come through that door. She failed at the last part repeatedly. By mid-morning, she was in the upper corridor replacing the candles in the wall. Sconces, a task nobody wanted because the ceilings were high and the small ladder was unsteady when she heard it. Not a sound exactly. Something below sound. Something that pulled at that deep internal compass she still didn't have a name for. Directional and insistent, and edged with something she could only describe as wrongness. She came down the ladder, stood still in the corridor. Let the feeling locate itself. It was coming from the north wing, from Cale's chambers. She was moving before she had finished making the decision to move. The ladder forgotten, the candles forgotten, everything narrowing to that pull and the wrongness attached to it, and when she pushed open the heavy door to his outer chamber, the healer Dara was already inside, and the expression on Dara's face was one Saren had never seen on her before. Fear. Cale was on the floor. Not collapsed. Not in the way of someone who had fallen. He was on one knee, one hand braced against the stone, and the quality of his stillness was entirely wrong. Not the controlled stillness she knew. Something enforced by something else. Something working against him from the inside. His face was gray. "What's happening?" Saren's voice came out sharp. "I don't know." Dara's voice was not steady, and that alone was enough to make Saren's blood drop 10 degrees. "It started an hour ago. The shamans are coming, but..." She stopped, looked at Cale, then at Saren, with something in her eyes that looked like it was trying to decide whether to say something. "He spoke your name. Before it started. In the corridor, one of the men heard him say it. Just your name. And then..." Saren crossed the room and crouched in front of him. His eyes came up. Even now, gray-faced and clearly fighting something enormous, one hand pressed hard against the floor for balance, those silver eyes found hers with immediate precision, and the recognition in them was sharp and present, and it gutted her more than the fear on Dara's face had. "Tell me what's happening," she said. His jaw was set hard. There was a faint luminous quality to his skin that hadn't been there before. Something moving just below the surface, the way light moves underwater. "The curse," he said. His voice was rough, ground down. "It activates when..." He stopped. Something moved through him, visible, like a wave of pressure. His hand against the floor went white, knuckled. "When you love someone," Saren said quietly. He looked at her and said nothing, which was itself the most complete answer she had ever received from him. Something inside her went very, very quiet. Then it went very, very bright. "All right," she said. Her voice surprised her, calm, direct, the fear in her chest absolutely present, and absolutely beside the point. "All right. Look at me. Keep your eyes on me. Saren." I said, "Look at me." She reached out and took his face in both hands. His face, cupped between her bandaged palm and her bare one, the gesture enormous and entirely instinctive, and something she would not have been capable of yesterday, and she made him hold her gaze. "You are not doing this. Do you understand me? You are not allowed." He made a sound that was almost a broken laugh. "It's a curse. It doesn't negotiate. Everything negotiates. Saren." His hands came up and closed around her wrists, not pulling away, holding. The way she had held the tray the first night. The way a person holds something they know they're about to lose and can't stop themselves reaching for anyway. You need to step back. Whatever is in your blood, whatever magic you're carrying, it'll accelerate that. You found me when I was dying in the snow, she said. He went still. You didn't know me. I was nobody to you. I was a girl in a gray dress in a courtyard. And you came outside without your boots in a blizzard, and you carried me in, and you sat beside me all night. Her voice was steady and enormous, and she meant every single word of it, the way she had never meant anything. So you're not allowed to die now. You found me first. That's not how this ends. Something cracked open in his expression. Not broke, opened. Like a door that had been locked from the inside for a very long time, finally coming off its bolt. The light she had been feeling build inside her since she'd entered the room, that old deep thing, the wordless resonance that had been waking in increments since the night he'd first walked across a frozen courtyard toward her, rose up fully now. Not gradually. All at once. Like it had been waiting for exactly this moment and this permission. And now that both had arrived, it was not going to waste another second. It came out of her hands. She felt it pass through her palms into his face, where she held him warm and luminous and absolutely ancient. Nothing like anything she had ever deliberately done. Nothing she was controlling, only moving through her toward him, the way water moves toward the lowest point. The air in the chamber went electric. Behind her, she heard Dara make a sharp sound. The light at the windows seemed to double. Cale's back straightened. The gray in his face began, fractionally, to recede. The curse pushed back. She felt it a pressure, cold and structured and old. Something that had been carefully and deliberately built over a long time by someone who had understood exactly what they were doing. It pressed against what was moving through her with the confidence of something that had never been successfully opposed. She didn't reason with it. She didn't negotiate with it. She simply refused it. With everything she had, with the full weight of the grief she had been carrying for 10 years and the warmth she had been rationing for 3, and the terrifying, enormous, completely inconvenient truth of what she felt for the man she was holding, she refused. The light exploded. Saren heard the windows rattle, felt the stone floor vibrate beneath her knees, felt something vast and cold and ancient come apart at its architecture, not gradually but all at once. The way ice fractures when the right pressure finds the right fault line, and then it was gone. Not diminished, not weakened. Gone. The room went quiet. She was on both knees, breathing hard, her hands still holding his face. Cale was looking at her. His color was back. His eyes were fully himself, silver gray and specific, and reading her face with an intensity that had nothing measured about it now. Nothing contained. Something outside was happening. She could hear voices, running footsteps, the distant sound of someone calling, but inside the chamber, the world had narrowed to the space between two people on a stone floor in the north wing of a winter keep, and neither of them moved, and neither of them looked away. The curse was broken, and whatever had broken it was still glowing, faintly, in the palms of her hands. She woke to warmth. That was the same as the first time. But where the first time she had woken to the warmth with disorientation, with the careful blankness of someone who didn't know what they were returning to, this time she woke slowly, and with a fullness that was entirely unfamiliar, a bone-deep settledness, like something that had been quietly unmoored inside her for a very long time, had finally, in the dark while she was sleeping, found its anchor. She opened her eyes to the vaulted stone ceiling of Cale's chambers, the large fire, the amber light. This time, she didn't sit up in alarm. She turned her head. He was in the same chair. Different position, elbows on knees, head bent slightly, hands loose, and there was something in the looseness of him that she had never seen before. A week ago, even sitting still, he had carried the entire weight of the North in his posture. Now the posture was still authoritative, that was simply his bones. She was beginning to understand, but the weight was different. Lighter, like something that had been pressing down from the inside had, finally, lifted. He looked up when she moved. Their eyes met. "You stayed," she said. Her voice was rough with disuse. "I said I would." "How long was I?" "Weeks," he said, simply, without dressing it up. 3 weeks and 4 days. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing that, The keep is fine. Aldrich is in custody and will remain so. His allies have been addressed. A brief pause. The shamans examined you on the 9th day. They wanted me to know what you are. His voice shifted, just slightly, something careful and wondering in it that she had never heard before. Saren, your pack. I know what I am, she said quietly. The last living healer of the Ashenmoor line. He said it like he was still making peace with the scale of it. A bloodline the Northern Territories thought was gone for 30 years. She looked at the ceiling. I was 7 when the pack fell. I ran for 3 days before a traveling merchant found me on the road. I've been smaller than I was ever since. She considered the phrasing. It seemed safer. I know. His voice was quiet. You don't have to be smaller anymore. She looked at him. He had moved from the chair. She hadn't registered it happening, but he was beside her now, standing. Then, with a deliberateness that was entirely uncharacteristic of the composed and commanding man she had watched run the North from a chair at the head of a feast table, he moved to one knee beside her. Cale, on one knee, in his own chambers, looking up at her. She opened her mouth. Don't, he said gently. Let me say it. She closed her mouth. His voice was low and entirely sure, not performed certainty, not authority, for the room, the real kind, the kind that has been tested. You were a maid when I met you. You were invisible by design and freezing in a courtyard because someone thought you were disposable, and you were impossibly the bravest and most stubborn and most inconveniently honest person I had ever tried to have a conversation with. Something moved across his face, almost a smile, closer than anything she had seen yet. You have broken an ancient curse, routed a conspiracy, and told me what I needed to hear instead of what I wanted to hear on approximately every occasion I gave you the opportunity. And you held my face in a dying room and refused to let me go. He held her gaze. You are the only Luna I will ever have, and I would very much like to ask if you'll accept that, formally, from the floor. She stared at him. Her chest was doing something it had no previous experience with, full to the point of overflow, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. She thought about the gray dress, the eyes down rule, the 3 years of careful invisibility in a keep full of people who had looked through her. She thought about a door that locked from the inside, and a window that faced a courtyard, and a man who had come outside without his boots. She thought about what it meant to be found. Not rescued. Found. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. That almost smile became something more. Just slightly. Just enough. The first full, real, unguarded smile she had ever seen on his face. And it was quietly devastating and entirely worth the wait. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at him. Does this mean, she said carefully, that I can stop cleaning the castle? He looked at her. The smile didn't go anywhere. Absolutely not. She laughed. She hadn't laughed she genuinely couldn't remember how long. It came out soft and surprised and real, and she felt it move through her like the first warm thing after a long, cold season. Cale rose from the floor and sat beside her, and the weight of him beside her on the mattress was steady and solid and entirely right, and outside the chamber she could hear the keep moving through its morning feet in corridors, voices in the kitchen, the distant clang of the training yard, and all of it felt, for the first time, like a place she belonged to rather than a place she was temporarily permitted to exist in. They said afterward that the Alpha King of the North found a maid in a courtyard on the night of the winter feast, unconscious in the snow, with no cloak and no name that anyone in the keep knew to call. They said he carried her inside. They said something ancient and unbreakable came apart 3 weeks later in the North Wing, with no explanation the shamans could fully articulate, only the residual warmth in the stone floors, and the light that some of the household staff swore they saw come through the windows from the inside out. What they didn't say, what they didn't have quite the right language for, was what it looked like in the East Garden on winter evenings afterward. A man and a woman on a stone bench, talking in low voices, the most feared Alpha King in the Northern Territories, and the woman who had looked him in the eye from the bottom of an impossible night and told him, simply, that he was not allowed to die. The Alpha King found a freezing maid that winter night. And somehow, in the space between a locked door and a broken curse, between a question about moonlight and a man on one knee on a cold stone floor, he ended up finding his heart instead. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Moonbound Romance Tales. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.